Every compassionate person knows what war means. It means death and destruction and endless suffering. And although there was no war of independence in Germany, there were a number of wars and battles that had a major impact on the Federal Republic as we know it today. Let's take a closer look at some of them. The oldest known battle probably took place in the Tollense Valley in what is now Mecklenburg-Western Pomerania in the Bronze Age around 1300 BC. Around 4,000 people fought in a battle with an unknown outcome, presumably over ancient trade routes. It was not until 1996 that the first findings were made. A better known battle with a known outcome but an unknown battlefield is the Varus battle, or the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD. 3 legions and their supporting troops were routed by united Germanic tribes under the officer Arminius, who was of Germanic origin but trained in Rome and completely destroyed within 3 days. The consequences were initially a westward campaign by the united Germanic tribes, who then fell out again, and Rome's later efforts to conquer other parts of Germania came to an end. As a result, the Rhine and the Limes remained roughly the borders of the Roman Empire. To protect the borders, the Romans also contracted Germanic warriors on the northern Rhine, the Franci, as Roman sources of the 4th century called them. When the Roman Empire began to decline, the hour of the Saar Franks arrived. First, they took control of the northern territories. Then, from around the year 500, the Frankish Empire grew, mostly through successful conquest, to its maximum extent from Spain to central Germany and from Denmark to Italy. The Frankish Empire saw itself as the successor of the Roman Empire. An important point during the formation of the Frankish Empire was the feudal system and the associated landlordship. The simple peasant were thus bound to the lord's land. The great leaders were Clovis, Pippin, and Charlemagne. It was Pippin III who entered into a treaty with the Pope around 750, securing the Carolingian dynasty as rulers and, in turn, endowing the Papal States with land. Charlemagne was crowned Roman Emperor on 25th of December 800. He was on par with the Emperor of Byzantium and the Abbasid Caliph. While the Frankish Empire was always divided between the sons of the king but remained united, Charlemagne's son Louis the Pious wanted to abolish the division and maintain a unified empire. However, this is exactly what led to the final division into 3 parts. France emerged from the western part, the Kingdom of Burgundy and the Duchy of Lorraine from the center, and the Holy Roman Empire of German nations from the eastern part. The Holy Roman Empire also expanded its territories through various conquests to the east. The aim was to Christianize the Slavs. In addition to new believers for the church, the princes also gained new subjects. There were several wars against Poland in the 10th century until the Peace of Bautzen in 1018, when they fought together against Kievan Rus. However, this only lasted for a short time, and then they fought again in various alliances against the Hungarians, the Poles, and the Kievan Rus. Wars were also waged against other internal and external enemies, such as in Flanders or in Italy, when they intervened in the disputes between the Ghibellines and the Guelphs, and were thus at odds with the Pope. They fought in several crusades toward Jerusalem, but in the 13th century also in crusades to the east along the Baltic coast, in which the Teutonic Order conquers area of what would later become Prussia and Lithuania. In 1499 they lost the Swiss War and the confederation retains a certain degree of independence. After the Reformation, the emperor repeatedly fought against Protestant alliances with varying results. Between 1593 and 1606, it fought with Hungary, the Pope, and Spain against the Ottomans. The 30 Years' War then begins in 1618. The Catholic lead fights alongside the Habsburgs and the emperor against Bohemia, Saxony, Prussia, Hesse-Kassel, the Netherlands and Sweden. Most of the battles took place on German soil, and large armies traveled through the country and had to be supplied. Beginning with the defenestration of Prague, after the Protestant Bohemians rebelled against recatholicization, there were subsequently also Swedish and French interests. 2 attempts to end the war with peace failed, and it was not until 1648, with the Peace of Westphalia, that an agreement was reached that was accepted by all parties involved. The big loser was the empire. The emperor and the imperial estate had renegotiated the rights without either side gaining any particular advantage. However, the treatment of the confession was newly regulated. Sweden and France gained territories, and the Netherlands and the Swiss Confederation left the Imperial Confederation. As a result, the Holy Roman Empire lost almost all of its major harbor cities, either through the withdrawal of the Netherlands or the loss of the territories on the Baltic Sea to Sweden. Hamburg became important as a result. But the citizens were even bigger losers. Due to the war, famine, epidemics, and in some cases looting and atrocities committed by the armies, some areas were 2/3 depopulated. The battles were largely fought with mercenary armies. The mercenary armies that did not find employment in the Italian or Franco-Spanish War subsequently wreaked havoc on the country as marauding bands. France, Sweden, and the Netherlands developed into nation-states and, like England, flourished with the newly emerging trade. The 30 Years' War was the first war to remain in the collective memory of the German lands. For a long time afterwards, the emperor was no longer in a position to undertake external campaigns. In addition to providing support in Turkish wars, the Palatinate War of Succession, or 9 Years' War against France, took place from 1688 to 1697. As far as German territories were concerned, this was about Alsace, Lorraine, and the Palatinate, and in addition to the Holy Roman Empire, England, Scotland, Spain, and the Netherlands fought also together against France. But from 1701 to 1714, the War of the Spanish Succession saw other alliances, and France and Spain fought together with Bavaria against the Holy Roman Empire, Great Britain, the Netherlands, and Portugal. The consequences had more impact on Austria than on the German lands. At the same time, there was a great Northern War in which the Russian Tsarist Empire, Saxony, Poland, and Denmark-Norway fought against Sweden for supremacy in the Baltic Sea. With numerous changes of allies on both sides, Prussia joined in 1715 under the soldier King Frederick William I and took the territories around Stettin. This put an end to the Swedish supremacy and its importance as a great power, while Russia became a great power. Emperor Charles VI of Habsburg died in 1740, leaving no heirs. His daughter Marie Theresia inherited the throne as Archduke of Austria, which naturally attracted other interested parties as she was only a woman. Fighting on the Austrian side were Saxony, Electoral Hanover, and the associated English royal family, while France, Sweden, Prussia, Bavaria, and Genoa were among those on the opposite side. The war only ended in 1748 with battles in Europe, North and South America, and on the water. As part of this almost global war, there were also two Silesian wars with Prussia participation, in which Silesia fell to Prussia. Prussia's gain paid off a few years later as the 7 Years' War began in 1756, with Prussia once again fighting for the Silesian territories. For Great Britain and France, on the other hand, it was more about supremacy in America, and other European powers wanted to expand their position. Depending on your point of view, the war is therefore referred as the Third Silesian War, as the Prussian called it, or as the French and Indian War. On the Prussian side, alongside a number of smaller German principalities, was Great Britain, which was more concerned with Belgium and the French colonies. On the other side were Russia, Austria, France, Sweden, Saxony and Spain. Because Maria Theresia was the Archduchess of Austria, Tsarin Elizabeth ruled over Russia, and the French King Louis XV had the influential mistress Madame Pompadour. The King of Prussia, Frederick II, the Old Fritz, also referred to them as a three horse. The war went from bad to worse for Prussia, which lost various territories to the oppressive superiority of the Austrian, French and Russians. But in 1762, Tsarina Elizabeth died, and her nephew Peter III, an admirer of Frederick, succeeded to the Tsar's throne and withdrew from the war and returned the occupied territories to Prussia. Later, he even allied himself with Prussia. However, many did not want this, and so he was murdered, and Catherine II, or Catherine the Great, became Tsarina, withdrew from the alliance but left the peace intact. In the end, the Peace of Hubertusburg restored the status quo before the war with regard to the Silesian territories. Prussia was now the fifth great power in Europe after Great Britain, France, Austria and Russia. A first sense of a unified Germany may also have emerged here. From 1772 to 1795, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was divided between Russia, Austria and Prussia. The War of the Bavarian Succession between Prussia and Austria passed without any significant battles, a novelty in the warfare of the time. From 1792, the coalition wars against the French Republic were fought and lost until Napoleon defeated and ended the Holy Roman Empire in 1806. The imperial crown then passed to Austria and the Austro-Hungarian Danube monarchy. However, many civil liberties were gained through French law. The influence of the Church was also reduced in the Catholic regions. Whereas in the Middle Ages the Bohemian king was one of the most powerful in the Holy Roman Empire, later it was the Habsburgs in Austria and Prussia who had been vying for supremacy for years. Napoleon was so impressed by Prussia's military might that he occupied Prussia and did not allow them to train the soldiers for long. Whereas mercenary armies had been used until the 30 Years' War, the regions had standing armies of well-trained soldiers in the 18th century. Instead of 200,000 soldiers, Prussia was not allowed to have more than 42,000 soldiers. Army reforms began under Scharnhorst, Gneisenau and others, some of which met with resistance from the nobility. Officers were now to be selected and promoted according to ability and knowledge and no longer according to aristocratic status. Reservists were also trained in the army, and a Landwehr was founded for home defense and given military training. The status of soldiers and military law were also changed. For example, corporal punishment for soldiers were abolished, as the new soldier in Prussia was to serve voluntarily and with commitment, following the French model. The freedom of the soldier was therefore important, and in future military punishment applied during the period of service and not during leave. Instead of corporal punishment, there were then custodial sentences. This gave them enough soldiers in 1812 to challenge Napoleon after his retreat from Prussia and achieve a first armistice. At a peace congress in Prague, Austria was then sided with the anti-Napoleon alliance, as were Russia and Sweden. The demands led to new battles, which culminated in the Battle of Leipzig and led to Napoleon's defeat, abdication and exile. General conscription was also introduced in 1814. The other German states, such as Saxony, Bavaria and Württemberg, also followed the military reforms, whether directly from the French or following the success of Prussia from their example. In 1848, there was an uprising in many German regions, which was supported by the well-trained Landwehr, among others, and was intending to bring about a united Germany with democratic reforms. In most areas, these uprisings were violently suppressed. In Prussia, they came to terms with the division of democratic forces under the Prussian king. In Schleswig and Holstein, this endeavor was supported in order to get Schleswig and Holstein out of Danish rule. The first Schleswig-Holstein War of the German Confederation against Denmark, which was supported by Russia, Sweden, the French Empire and Great Britain, was lost. The second German-Danish War in 1864, in which Prussia and Austria fought against Denmark, was won by the invaders, and Schleswig and Holstein became part of the German Confederation. Bismarck's skillful tactics and uprisings in Poland kept Great Britain and Russia out of this war. Sweden came too late, and France did not want to help. As a result, the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein were jointly administered by Austria and Prussia. However, Otto von Bismarck, the first professional politician in Prussia, had other plans and wanted a small German solution with Prussia at the head without Austria. In 1866, the German War broke out between the German Confederation with Austria as its head against Prussia and Italy, which Prussia and its allies won, dissolving the German Confederation and replacing it with a North German Confederation. On the other hand, Prussia won a large part of the North German lands and Italy gained Veneto. It was also Bismarck who tricked the French to declare war on Prussia in 1870. The declaration of war from outside meant that the case of alliance occurred, and the other states of the North German Confederation now had to support Prussia in the ensuing war. Also, the French went to war confident of victory. They lost the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871. During the siege of Paris, Bismarck took the opportunity to have King William of Prussia proclaimed Emperor of the German Empire. The siege of Paris showed the new way of war. Long-range artillery in the siege ring fired into the city to persuade the population to surrender. As shown in this video, the Red Cross in the German lands helped to ensure that the survival rate of wounded soldiers in German hospitals was considerably higher than in French hospitals. In the end, France had to cede Alsace and part of Lorraine and pay war reparations. It was Bismarck who subsequently concluded various treaties with the other European states, which contained alliances or non-aggression pacts that guaranteed a certain degree of security for the stability of the German Empire. After this war, Germany began its colonial policy and fought individual battles in its colonies in Africa, Asia, or Oceania. After the death of Emperor William I, his son Frederick III was no friend of Bismarck, and his son William II was also an opponent of Bismarck and wanted a dynamic and risk-taking foreign policy instead of a conservative one. Bismarck was dismissed in 1890, dropping the pilot, it was said. Neglected alliances before the First World War meant that Germany was closely allied with Austria. But the other powers such as Russia, France and Great Britain had alliances all around them. When Austria declared war on Serbia, Russia, which was allied with Serbia, intervened, and as a result of which the German Empire and initially Italy also entered the war on the side of Austria and France on the side of Russia and Serbia. A quick strike against France was not possible, as France had erected the Barrière de Fer, the Iron Barrier, with fortifications on the border, and neutral Belgium refused to march through. When Germany tried to force passage, the Belgians resisted, and the British, who were allied with them, entered the war as opponents of Austria-Germany. Later, the Ottoman Empire also entered the war on the side of the Central Powers. Also, Russia left the war prematurely due to the Communist Revolution and had to make territorial concessions to Austria and Germany. The German divisions that were freed up were unable to bring about any change in either the south or the west until the USA also entered the war, and supplies at home had almost completely collapsed due to the British naval blockade. In the end, the Central Powers lost. Poland, Czechoslovakia and the Baltic states were created, Hungary became independent, and Germany lost territories to Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and France, including Alsace-Lorraine. In addition, all colonies. Germany also had to pay war reparations. Similar to Prussia at that time, the German Empire was now to have a reduced military. The German Emperor had also to abdict, and a democratic republic was proclaimed out of fear that a socialist Soviet republic might emerge. Thus the Second Revolution, the November Revolution of 1918, 80 years after the German Revolution of 1848, led to a democracy. If every war is always bad, both for the soldiers involved and for the population in the war zone, in this case it was also the population far behind the front that suffered bitter hardship. While the colonies were able to supply France and Great Britain, the citizens of Germany, including some in Austria, were affected by restrictions, and while enthusiasm for the war was relatively high in most nations at the beginning, by the end the population was exhausted and against it. In some cases, crops were confiscated in the eastern territories and taken to the German Reich or Austria, which in turn caused the population in what would later become Poland, Ukraine and Romania to starve. The great losses on all sides later also meant that in Great Britain, for example, there was no desire among the population to put Hitler in his place early on war with him. Because the censorship of the press had only reported on victories of the German army, the lie of the stab in the back legend arose that the army had been stabbed in the back by politicians. In fact, it was the last offensives that tried to reach Paris with the additional divisions from the east before the USA sent soldiers into the battle that sealed the end. However, it was among other things the legend of the invincible army and the propaganda about the shameful peace treaty, which of course democratic politicians had entered into without need, that later led to the National Socialists seizing power and the Second World War. However, the 100,000-man army really did mean that officers were selected according to their qualifications. The newly founded Reichswehr introduced assessment centers for this purpose, which later also found their way into the economy. When the German Reich under the Nazis then plunged Europe into the Second World War, the Germans initially conquered large parts of Eastern and Northern Europe as well as France. In the end, they lost again in a war on two fronts, because this time Russia, or the Soviet Union, did not leave the war prematurely and advanced inexorably towards Berlin with incredible losses. Some of the atrocities committed during this war are indescribable. The civilian population suffered to an unimaginable extent, both in occupied territories and through targeted attacks against cities without deliberately attacking military installations or factories in order to demoralize the civilian population. The Oder-Neiße line was defined as a new eastern border. All territories that previously belonged to Prussia now became part of Poland, or Kaliningrad became part of Russia or the Soviet Union. Alsace-Lorraine was clearly annexed to France, and the Saarland remained independent and was courted by France to join it. The country was divided in 4 parts and occupied by Great Britain, France, the USA and the Soviet Union. The Soviet-occupied zone became the GDR, with the divided city of Berlin at its center. The new Federal Republic learned from the mistake of the Weimar Republic, the first democracy on German soil, and strengthened the laws to ensure that no one individual could ever again gain too much power. Due to the opposing ideologies in the West and the East, the Federal Republic was initially supported by the USA with money and goods during the Cold War against the wishes of France, so that the economy could be rebuilt. In contrast, the economy in the Soviet-occupied zone was dismantled by the USSR. After the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall, Germany was democratically reunified and is now a democratic state in the center of Europe and in the middle of the European Union. And while after the Second World War some still wanted the Eastern territories back, today there is a consensus that the Federal Republic should remain within its border. Austria is something like a good friend or relative in the neighbor's house. We share common history, but now live apart without any desire to move back in together. What still reminds us of the war, however, is the regular discovery of bombs during the construction work or the work of munition clearance teams on the beaches of the North and Baltic Seas or inland, who have to deal with discarded ammunition. On the one hand, there are Allied aerial bombs that did not detonate after being dropped. On the other hand, there are unexploded bombs from the battles, such as unexploded shells or residual munitions that were dumped in lakes or the North Sea or Baltic Sea. Almost 80 years after the war, people still have to evacuate when another aerial bomb is found, or a hole is built over an old lake in which explosive ordnance disposal teams search the old lake bed year in, year out to find and dispose on chemical warfare agents. It is estimated that there are still 100,000 to 300,000 tons of unexploded ordnance on German soil, and with around 5,000 disarmament operations a year, it will probably take decades. After all, very few unexploded bombs weigh a ton. Most are hand grenades or artillery shells. A job that is becoming increasingly dangerous as the detonation mechanism and the explosives themselves had become more and more unstable over time. Once or twice a year, an unexploded bomb detonates on its own. At that time, virtually no landmines were used against the civilian population. It is hard to imagine how much work will be needed after the current wars if bomblets were used instead of massive bombs and parts of them did not explode, or if, as in the Balkans, areas were mined to make them inaccessible to the local civilian population. Unfortunately, human developments are not always used to make the world a little better, and far too often you want to see the beautiful army in action. Perhaps it would be better to take the example of King Frederick William I, the soldier king. He loved soldiers but not wars, because wars cost money and destroy the beautiful army. Let's hope for a peaceful future. Thank you for your attention. See you in the next video.